In this video, we're going to look at the fact that the way people think and communicate is significantly impacted by the way they were brought up, in most cases to a much greater extent than most people realize. So the way I love to illustrate this point is by looking at the way people like change to happen. Because my contention is the way we like change to happen depends to a significant extent on where we were brought up. And the way I like to illustrate this point is by comparing the political history of, technically we have 5 countries: Canada, the US, India, Nigeria, Jamaica. Hong Kong is not a country, it is a special administrative region of China. To simplify, I will call it a country, just because country rolls off the tongue much more easily than political entity. So, from a political history perspective, these 6 countries have one common characteristic. They were all colonies of the United Kingdom. And today, none of them is. So what that means is a significant change happened. So the question becomes, well, how and when did the change happen? In the case of the United States, most viewers will know that the United States became independent from the United Kingdom in 1776 on July 4th, and that's why Americans call that date Independence Day. The independence of the United States came through a war, the Revolutionary War, which started with the Boston Tea Party and ended 10 years later with the Treaty of Paris. In the case of India, I'm sure many of you know that India became independent through the non-violent movement, which was led by Mahatma Gandhi, and I'm sure many of you have seen the movie depicting his life. India became independent in 1947 on August 15th. There was no war between India and the UK. There was violence within India between religious groups, and there was a war right after independence between India and Pakistan, but that's a separate story. Nigeria became independent on October 1st, 1960. In the case of Nigeria, again, there was no war between Nigeria and the United Kingdom. There was a war in Nigeria after independence, the Biafra War, which resulted in a massive famine. The case of Jamaica, no war. And Jamaica became independent on August 6, 1962. Hong Kong did not become independent. It went from being British to being Chinese, and that happened, the change happened on July 1st, 1997. So they scheduled the handover ceremony, as it was called, on June 30th at midnight. At midnight, the Union Jack goes down, the Chinese flag goes up, fireworks started. My wife is Chinese, she was in Hong Kong at the time. She says police officers took up the British cap, put on the Chinese cap. They removed the patches on the shoulders, put new ones, done. So in other words, people in Hong Kong went to bed British on June 30th and woke up on July 1st Chinese. In the case of Canada, the change happened in a very different manner. Independence happened in a very different manner. So the date that Canadians celebrate every year is July 1st, 1867. What happened that day? A bunch of guys sat in a room in PEI and signed a document. Ta-da! We are a Dominion. Dominion is more independent than a colony, but it is not fully independent in the sense that in the second half of 1867, Canada was still lacking many of the attributes we associate with being a country. So for example, there was no such thing at the time as a Canadian flag, a Canadian passport, Canadian Army. All these things in Canada's case were put in place one by one. So for example, in 1871, the first Canadian dollar was printed. It took about 4 years for Canadians to realize that having one currency per province is not going to work. In 1909, Canada named its first foreign minister. There was no foreign policy before. In 1915, Canada created its first army. There were Canadian soldiers between 1867 and 1915, but they were part of British units. For example, some of them fought in the Boer War as part of British units. In 1934, Canada created the central bank. So this is when the first discussions of interest rates started. In 1947, Canadians became Canadian. What do I mean by that? This is the year the first Canadian passports were printed and Canadian citizenship was created. In 1949, Canada created the Supreme Court. If you didn't like a judicial decision before 1949, you could appeal at the Privy Council in London. In 1965, Canada created the flag, the maple leaf, which most people recognize around the world. What was the Canadian flag before 1965? Well, it was the British ensign. In 1982, Canada repatriated its constitution. What does that mean? Well, today Canada can change its constitution without asking London for approval. All Canadians have to do is agree among themselves. Now, that's a tall order, but that's a different story. Okay? They have control of their own constitution. And the Queen is still the head of state. So what does that mean? Well, in Canada's case, you can say, depending on how you define being independent, that Canada became independent in 1867, 1871, any of these dates, or not yet. Nice bit of historical trivia. But what does it mean from the perspective of culturally different people working together in the same office? Well, here's the idea. How do you think Americans, Indians, Nigerians, Jamaicans, and people in Hong Kong like change to happen? Very typically, their idea of change is erase and start over. What is the Canadian idea of change? Well, I grew up in France. So France is obviously not on the incremental change side. France is a country where change, like in the US, India, and so on, happens in a revolutionary manner. So in France, when we change things, we behead a few 100,000 people, start over. That's typically the process. I'm kidding, but not that much. The point is, in France, we're used to revolutionary change. What I have found is, in Canada, the fastest way to get your idea rejected, if you want to propose change, is to tell Canadians, I've got a great idea, we'll change everything by 50%, and we'll change everything and we'll improve things by 50%. The reaction you're going to get from Canadians is, it will never work. What they forget to add is in Canada. It can work elsewhere, but it will not work in Canada. How do you make change happen in Canada so that Canadians accept it? Well, you have to make change incrementally. Let me give you a concrete example. So, I worked as a product development engineer for Procter & Gamble. The way this came into play on several occasions went like this. My boss comes to me and says, Lionel, improve the product. No problem, I can improve the product, that's my job. But my first reaction, since I grew up in France, to improve the product is essentially scrap the old one. I take a blank sheet of paper, make a clean sheet design, work on it for 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, I take my design, put it on my boss's desk, and I go, ha, here's the new design. My boss looks at it, and he grew up in Saskatchewan. So he looks at it and he goes, well, that's not what I expected. At that very moment, my boss and I experienced what I consider as the essence of cultural differences in the workplace. He and I measured my performance based on criteria which we both learned implicitly going up through the educational system that taught us. The trouble is, because I grew up in France, I never took a course on how to make change happen. But every time we talked about change, we talked about it in revolutionary terms. My boss grew up in Saskatchewan. He has never taken a course on how change should happen, but every time he discussed change, it was always in an incremental manner. So he looks at my design and he thinks I've wasted 3 weeks. I look at it and I go, I've done an amazing job. He does not understand. This is the essence of cultural differences in the workplace. So if you're an immigrant and you want to introduce change in Canada, there's 2 ways that work really well, in my experience. One is the sliced bread approach. Whatever change you're thinking of making, slice it as thinly as you can make it. So in other words, if you think of this loaf of bread, you make thin slices. Each slice represents a small change you want to make. You introduce each change 1 per week or 1 per day over a period of time of 6 months, maybe a year. You've changed everything, nobody has noticed, and everybody's happy. The other approach, which is used extensively in Canada when we want to make change, is the pilot. Canadians pilot everything. Now, Americans will pilot projects too, but they pilot them differently. If Americans want to make a change of size 100, their approach will be to make a pilot at size 25. If they like it, learn from it, roll it out. If Canadians are going to pilot a project of size 100, what they will typically is start with a project of size 1 or 2. If that works, we go to size 30. If that works, we go to size 60, and we make sure all stakeholders are represented. Essential, okay, particularly if you work in large organizations or government. And then we go to size 100. So the key point is, it's not right, it's not wrong, it's different. And so the way we have been brought up has a huge impact on the way we think, communicate, and respond. And that's a key point I would like everybody to remember from this video.